Violence. This is a problem that is affecting the whole world. By violence, I'm trying to put my attention in the violence related to homicides, because that's the violence that you can measure across countries. In developed countries, there is a trend, even year after year, going down. There is not a problem of violence there, but in the rest of the world. Developing countries, especially Central America, is having a big problem with homicides. And in Africa, all the south cone of Africa is with high rates of homicide. In the last decade, Central America is in the top 3 basically countries of the world with homicide, and some researchers and scholars have said that's the proof that we have failed states. In some countries, the violence is related to different processes of crime, like narco activities or youth gang members fighting for a specific territory. In both cases, the problem is directly related to the state, because they are challenging the authority of the state within its territory. The basic problem that the state solves is precisely that people only have to answer to one power, coercive power. But when dead people start to appear in the streets, it means that there are other groups attempting to challenge the monopoly of coercive power. The state in every country is supposed to protect the life of the citizens, of every human being within its territory. And one measure of failure of success of the state is the homicide rates. This is related to any type of crime that has an outcome as a dead body. Generally speaking, for the researcher point of view, we don't know why that body appears in the street or somewhere. That will be like the criminal justice system, who is at the end of a long process is going to say, well, this was a kidnapping that ends badly, or this was police repression against youth gangs. We don't know like the immediate motivation for those killings, but that's one of the problems with the data. Sometimes you don't know if it's an accident, suicide, or somebody that actually attempted to kill somebody else and succeeded. What I have been doing is following the data and the statistics in Guatemala and Central America in the last decade, trying to understand the behavior of this type of violence. That will help us to understand how we need to strengthen our institutions, and especially try to understand the causes of this homicide, because everybody speaks loudly about different type of causes that might be at the origin of this problem, but nobody has really measured those or doing, fine-tuned research. For instance, the debate in our countries is always between if poverty has a lot to explain. And we have been poor nations since the beginning, but we didn't experience this type of violence as now. We have armed conflicts, But now, after peace agreements and democratization in the area, it seems like there is more violence than before. So that's a sort of paradox that it is important to understand, and there is a puzzle that is important to solve, because even the success in the long term of democracy depends on people believing that democracy delivers something. The big problem is homicides of regular people who are in the streets, that they have their cell phones and somebody wants to take it and they just shot you. So this type of violence is more relevant in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama, which are in the south of Central America, is not that relevant, although perceptions might be the same. For instance, in Costa Rica, they usually have 1 digit of homicide rates, but people live more with some paranoia about crime, even more than in Guatemala City. So for instance, we're talking about in Costa Rica 2 years ago, they actually reached 2 digits, like 11 or 12 homicides per every 100,000 people. Last year they came back to 9, but in Honduras we're talking about 80 deaths per every 100,000 people. In El Salvador, above 60 or 70, and in Guatemala, during the last 3 years, we are witnessing a decrease from 45 in 2008 and 2009 to 39 in 2011, and this year we are gonna end probably around 32, 33. So it's 3 years in a row going down in the homicide rates. We don't know yet. We have some hypotheses. One, mine is related to organized crime. They were fighting for territories, and once they achieved their goal and they eliminated the enemies, the rival cartel, they don't need to kill more people. So they have imposed their own law in the territory. Other people think that members of the youth gangs have reached some sort of agreement of no aggression, not killing each other anymore. So that helps. And that's the case that is well documented in El Salvador, for instance, where there is at this moment an OAS, Organization of American States, is involved in verifying this agreement between the two major gangs. So in that case, it's true. In the case of Guatemala, it's just one rumor that the agreement in El Salvador affected positively Guatemala. Yeah, in 2012, we are following the evolution of the data monthly in an attempt to give some advice in terms of alerts of what's going on at the local level, at the municipality level. So I'm following the homicide rates in every of the 334 municipios of Guatemala. Especially attention is given to the 3 largest municipios, which are Guatemala City, Villanueva, and Mixco. Guatemala City has almost 1 million people. Villanueva and Mixco have 500,000 each of them, but the 3 are neighbors. So there you have a metropolitan area of more than 2 million people, and those 3 municipios are the most violent in the whole country. You can explain 26% of violence only with these 3 municipios, and they only have 13% of the population. So they are really overrepresented in the geography of violence. So if we can understand what's going on there and stop violence in these 3 municipios, we are gonna succeed at the national level for sure. Well, what has happened is that violence has decreased in the whole country month after month. At this point, we have a 18% reduction of homicide rates that can be explained especially because it's going down in those 3 municipios. Especially good news is related crime or homicides against women, which was a big concern in the last years. In these 6 months, the decrease was of 25% in homicides of women. You know, generally speaking, in Guatemala, the history and in other countries, for every woman who is victim of violence, there are 10 men who are victim of violence. At this moment, it's for 1 woman, 8 men, because the decrease in both groups, both genders, has changed the relationship. Violence in Guatemala is not the same in the whole territory. There are municipios and departamentos that have rates as the US or Europe. I mean, 1 digits of violence. And this is one of the most important hypotheses that nobody has tested yet in Guatemala. And that's the cultural variable, because those municipios and departamentos with low levels of homicide are mainly indigenous population. People themselves in those areas identify themselves as indigenous people. They have a different ethos than the rest of the population, their values, beliefs, cosmology, everything. So that might be explaining how they deal with conflict. So we are following that with a ranking of departamentos, and we can see which are in the top of the table, which means above the national average, and who are the departamentos in the bottom of the table. There is a coincidence between this cultural cleavage in Guatemala with the map of violence. And that's very interesting, and that's one of the areas where social scientists, we have to put our effort and try to understand that.